14 years of marriage collapsed into one sentence, spoken so calmly it was almost polite. Dennis Whitfield looked at his wife, standing in the middle of his mother Ruth's living room in Savannah, Georgia, surrounded by every member of his family, and he pointed, not at her face, not at the door, at the hardwood floor directly in front of where Amber Cross was sitting, and he said, "Get on your knees and apologize to her. I mean it, Diane. Right now." The children near the window stopped playing. Ruth's hand, which had been reaching for her tea, froze midair. Every adult in that room turned to stone at the exact same moment, watching a man they had known their whole lives hand his dignity to a stranger and demand his wife surrender hers. And Diane Calloway Whitfield, 44 years old, wearing the simple gold necklace her father Howard had clasped around her neck at her wedding, looked at Dennis with eyes that carried no tears. Only a stillness so complete, so practiced, it was almost frightening. Dear friends, welcome. And if you are new here, I want you to pull up a chair, because the story you are about to hear is one of those that will stay lodged somewhere behind your ribs long after you have finished watching. Go ahead right now and hit that subscribe button. Ring that notification bell so you are always the first to know when a new story drops. Tap that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Most importantly, drop a comment right now and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Are you watching from Texas, from Georgia, from Ohio, from Florida, from California? I read every single one of those comments personally. Now, let's go all the way back, before that living room, before Amber, before any of it, because you cannot understand what Diane did next until you understand exactly what kind of woman she was, and exactly what Dennis Whitfield chose to destroy. Diane Calloway grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the only child of Howard Calloway, a man who had built a commercial farming supply business from the ground up using nothing but a used Ford truck, a hand-painted sign, and a reputation for never once breaking his word. Howard was the kind of man who shook your hand once and meant it for life, who measured a person not by what they claimed, but by what they did when no one was watching. He raised Diane alone after her mother passed when Diane was 11, and he did it without complaint, without bitterness, and without ever once making her feel like a burden. He gave her three things that no amount of money could replace: discipline, dignity, and the unshakable belief that she deserved to be treated with respect. Diane grew up reading balance sheets at the kitchen table while Howard reviewed the books each night. By 18, she understood contracts. By 22, she had a business administration degree from the University of Tennessee. By 26, she was managing accounts for a mid-sized logistics firm in Nashville, doing work that men twice her age couldn't keep pace with. She met Dennis Whitfield at a professional networking event in Nashville when she was 30 years old. He was 34, regional director of operations for a commercial property group headquartered in Savannah, and he walked into that ballroom like a man who had decided in advance that everyone in it would want to know him. He was not wrong. Dennis had charm the way some people have weather. It simply surrounded him, and you found yourself in it before you had made any conscious decision to step closer. He found Diane near the far end of the bar, alone with a glass of sparkling water and a notebook she had been quietly referencing, and he was so struck by the fact that she wasn't working the room that he walked directly to her and said, "You're either the smartest person here or you lost a bet." She looked up at him and said, without missing a beat, "Both are possible." He laughed. She smiled. And something began that she would spend the next 14 years believing was the best decision she had ever made. They dated for 2 years. Dennis was attentive in that early season, the kind of attentive that makes a woman feel like the room rearranges itself around her when she walks in. He drove from Savannah to Nashville on weekends. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar. He met Howard early, drove to Knoxville with flowers for the house and a firm handshake for the old man. And Howard, who had always read people with the precision of a carpenter reading a level, had nodded his approval, though Diane would later remember a moment at dinner that evening when Howard had gone very quiet while Dennis was talking, and she had not known what to make of that silence. She had not given it enough weight. That is the thing about hindsight. It has perfect vision, and it is always too late. Diane and Dennis married in the fall, in a small outdoor ceremony in Knoxville with the Tennessee mountains turning gold in the distance, and she had been happy. Genuinely, completely happy. She had believed, with everything in her, that she had chosen wisely. The first years were stable enough that Diane convinced herself the choice had been right. They relocated to Savannah permanently, bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with a wide front porch and old oak trees lining the street. And Diane took a remote consulting position that let her work from home while Dennis managed his career's demands. She made friends slowly. She had always been that way, deliberate and selective, but the ones she made were loyal. Her closest was a woman named Patricia, a registered nurse she had met at a community board meeting, who had a laugh like a car engine turning over and the instincts of someone who had seen every variety of human being in crisis. Patricia had met Dennis 3 times in that first year, and each time, without ever saying anything specific, had looked at Diane with an expression that hovered somewhere between concern and restraint. Diane noticed. She chose not to ask. That, she would later understand, was the flaw she had carried her entire life. A willingness to let the unasked question protect her from the unbearable answer. The red flags came the way they always do, gradually, then all at once. Dennis started coming home later in the year. They turned 4 into the marriage. Not dramatically late. Never late enough to cause a real argument. Just late enough that dinner cooled and the house settled into a quiet that felt subtly different from the comfortable silences of their early years. He started leaving the room to take calls, always stepping onto the back porch, always pulling the door shut behind him, always returning with an explanation ready before she had asked a question. He became more careful with his phone, not paranoid, nothing that would raise immediate alarm, just careful in the precise way of a man who has begun to treat his phone like a private room only he holds the key to. There was a hotel charge on their joint account in September, a property 15 miles from their home, charged on a Wednesday evening when Dennis had told her he was attending a quarterly dinner with clients downtown. She had seen it while reviewing their finances. She always reviewed their finances. It was in her blood, and she had stared at that line item for a very long time before she closed the laptop. She did not confront him that night. She made dinner. She listened to him talk about his day. She watched the way his eyes moved when he spoke, cataloging things she had been too trusting to catalog before, and she thought about something her father had told her once when she was perhaps 15. Baby girl, when someone shows you something true about themselves, don't argue with it. Just file it. She filed it. She said nothing. But she began, slowly and methodically, the way Howard had taught her to approach anything that required clarity. She began to pay a different kind of attention. She started noticing patterns. The particular neutrality in Dennis's voice when he mentioned certain names. The way a pause could be 2 beats too long before an answer arrived. She did not rush. She waited the way her father had waited for hard soil to produce something worth harvesting, because Diane Calloway had inherited more from that man than she yet knew. Amber Cross had been in Dennis's professional orbit for almost 3 years before her name entered Diane's life. She was 28, a leasing consultant at a partner firm Dennis's company regularly worked with, and she was the kind of woman who made an entrance without trying, which is always the most dangerous kind. Diane first heard the name mentioned in passing, Dennis referencing a work event that Amber had coordinated, nothing significant, just a name floating through conversation like smoke. But the name appeared again, and again, always casual, always in context. But Diane noticed the specific neutrality Dennis employed when he said it, the over-controlled flatness of a man who has practiced a tone so many times it has started to sound rehearsed. She noted it. She said nothing. She simply added it to the file she was building in the back of her mind, page by careful page, the way her father had once kept handwritten records of every transaction his business ever made, because Howard had always believed that the truth lived in the details, and that the details always eventually told you everything. The crisis arrived in March, when Howard suffered a stroke. Diane got the call at 6 in the morning from Howard's neighbor, a retired man named Earl who checked on Howard every single day. And she was dressed, and in her car, and on the highway to Knoxville in under 20 minutes. Dennis did not offer to come. He said he had a presentation he couldn't cancel and that he would try to get up on the weekend. Diane drove those 7 hours to Knoxville alone, her hands steady on the wheel and her face arranged into the controlled expression she would wear for the next several months. The expression of a woman who is holding everything together because she is the only one holding anything at all. Howard was alive, but the doctors were direct with her. The stroke had compromised his heart significantly. He had perhaps 6 months, they said. Perhaps fewer. Diane sat in the chair beside his hospital bed that first night, holding his hand, and something very deep and very old inside her broke open quietly, the way ice cracks on a river in early spring, not all at once, but in a long, silent split that changes the entire structure of what was beneath. She drove back to Savannah on Monday and told Dennis the prognosis over dinner. He nodded. He said the appropriate things. He made the appropriate face. But his eyes moved to his phone once while she was speaking. Just once, just a flicker. And Diane saw it. And she cataloged it. And she pressed on with the conversation, and she did not cry. She visited Howard every weekend for the next 3 months. Dennis joined her twice. The first time because Diane asked directly, the second briefly, for a Sunday afternoon that he cut short to beat traffic. Howard, who was weaker by then, had watched his son-in-law move around that Knoxville kitchen with the detachment of a man who is visiting a stranger's house and counting the minutes until he can leave. And when Dennis had stepped outside to take a call, Howard had looked at his daughter from his chair by the window and said, very quietly, "Baby girl, what is happening in your house?" Diane had opened her mouth and closed it again. "We're fine, Daddy," she had said. "We're fine." Howard had looked at her for a long time and then turned back to the window, and she had known, in the marrow of her bones, that he knew, and that he was already doing something about it. It was during the 4th month of Howard's illness that Diane found the messages. She had not been searching. That is the truth of it. And it matters because it removes any trace of paranoia from what followed. She had picked up Dennis's phone to check the time because her own was charging across the room. And when the screen lit at her touch, a message notification sat there from a contact saved simply as A. The preview was cut off mid-sentence. But the 12 words she read in that half-second were enough to change the entire architecture of the past several years, rearranging every red flag she had filed, every silence she had filled with the benefit of the doubt, every hotel charge and porch phone call and carefully neutral tone, into a pattern so clear and so complete that she felt almost foolish for the time it had taken her to see the shape of it. She set the phone down exactly where she had found it. She went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the oak trees in the yard. Then she made a decision so quietly and so completely that it felt less like a decision and more like a door closing forever. She called Patricia the next evening from a parking lot 2 streets away. Patricia, who had been waiting for this call longer than Diane knew, listened without interrupting. When Diane finished, Patricia said one thing. "Tell me what you need." What Diane needed was information, clean, documented, airtight. Over the next 6 weeks, with Patricia's help and the assistance of a private investigator named Leonard, a quiet, thorough man who came recommended by an attorney Diane had consulted in complete confidentiality, she built a file. Dates, locations, photographs, financial records that told their own story with the merciless clarity of numbers. 3 years of Amber Cross and Dennis Whitfield, documented with the same meticulous precision Diane had always applied to balance sheets. She reviewed it all on a Friday night, alone, spread across the dining room table, while Dennis was supposedly working late. and when she was done, she organized every page neatly, placed it in a manila envelope, and locked it in the bottom drawer of her home office desk. Then she went to bed. She slept more soundly than she had in months, and that itself told her something important about how long she had been carrying what she now finally understood. Howard Calloway passed away on a Thursday morning in October, in his own bed, in his own house, with Diane sitting beside him and Earl waiting quietly in the hallway. He went the way people sometimes go when they have lived without cruelty, gently, with their affairs in order and their conscience clear. Diane held his hand until there was nothing left to hold, and then she sat in that room for a long time talking to him the way you talk to someone who has just gone, because the habit of their presence is too strong to break immediately. She drove back to Savannah the next morning. Dennis was home. He held her for the right amount of time, said the right words, arranged his face into the right expression. But his phone buzzed twice while his arms were around her, and she felt his body register it, felt the subtle tension of a man noting a signal while performing tenderness, and she pressed her face into his shoulder so he wouldn't see her eyes. She had learned his tells the way you learn a language you never wanted to study. She was fluent now. If you are still watching at this point, go to the comments right now and drop the words, "I'm still here." Let me see who is truly following this story, because what happens next is where everything turns, and I don't want you to miss a single second of it. Howard Calloway's estate went to probate, and Diane drove to Knoxville for the reading of the will, expecting what she had always assumed: the house, the truck, Howard's modest savings account, perhaps some equipment from the business. What she did not know, what Howard had never once mentioned, because Howard Calloway believed in silent preparation the way other men believed in loud declarations, was that in the final 2 years of his life, the agricultural supply business he had spent 4 decades building had been quietly acquired by a national distribution company based in Dallas, Texas. Howard had negotiated the sale himself, managed the proceeds with his attorney and a financial advisor he had trusted for 20 years, and invested them with the same deliberate patience he had applied to everything in his life. The number the estate attorney read aloud in that Knoxville conference room was $41,200,000. Diane sat across that table and did not move a single facial muscle. She looked at the document in front of her, thought about her father planting seeds in hard Tennessee soil and waiting for the ground to decide if it would reward him, and understood, with a certainty that filled her chest like sunlight breaking through cloud, that Howard had known all along what kind of man Dennis Whitfield was. And he had spent the last 2 years of his life making sure that when it finally mattered, when Diane chose to walk, she would walk with everything she needed to walk very, very far. She told no one. Not Dennis, not the extended family. She consulted with the estate attorney and then retained a separate attorney in Savannah, a woman named Barbara, who specialized in matrimonial asset protection and had a reputation for precision in a courtroom so absolute that opposing counsel sometimes requested continuances simply to recover their composure. She signed the necessary documents quietly, opened accounts Dennis had no knowledge of, and structured the inheritance under Barbara's guidance in ways that were entirely legal and entirely protected from the marriage under Tennessee inheritance law, provisions that would take any challenger a very long time to contest and would ultimately go nowhere if they tried. She filed every document. She prepared every contingency. And then she waited, because she still needed one thing. She needed Dennis to show her, publicly, completely, and without any possibility of ambiguity, exactly who he was. She did not have to wait long. The invitation to Ruth Whitfield's birthday dinner came 3 weeks later. A family gathering at Ruth's house in Savannah, the kind of event Diane had attended faithfully for 14 years. She accepted as she always did, brought flowers for Ruth, dressed neatly, and arrived with the quiet, pleasant composure that the Whitfield family had always mistaken for softness, and which had never, not for a single day of her life, been anything of the sort. What she had not anticipated, what even Diane, with all her careful preparation, had not predicted was that Dennis would bring Amber Cross to his mother's birthday dinner. He walked through Ruth's front door with Amber beside him and an explanation already assembled on his face. Something about a professional overlap, a scheduling conflict that couldn't be helped. And Diane watched Ruth's expression move through a dozen emotions in 4 seconds while Craig stood near the kitchen doorway, looking at the floor with the concentrated intensity of a man who desperately wants to be somewhere else. Diane said nothing. She set down her glass of sweet tea with perfect steadiness and watched Dennis move through the room with Amber. Watched Amber settle into the armchair near the fireplace with the practiced ease of a woman who knew exactly where she was, who knew the layout of this house, which chair caught the best afternoon light, where Ruth kept the good glasses. Amber had been in this house before. The family had known. All of them, for longer than Diane wanted to calculate, had known. Dennis turned to face Diane in the center of that living room, with everyone watching. And in his eyes was something that was not quite anger and not quite shame, but the specific compound of both that produces cruelty in men who have never been made to account for themselves. "I need you to apologize to Amber," he said, his voice dropping into that calm, controlled register that she now recognized as his most dangerous one. "I've told people how you've treated her, how you've made her feel unwelcome. I need you to own that. Right here. Right now, in front of everyone." Diane looked at him steadily. "I have never spoken a single word to that woman in my life," she said. Dennis's jaw tightened. He pointed at the floor in front of Amber's chair, deliberately, unmistakably, with the full weight of a public demand, and said, "Then get on your knees and apologize for how you've made her feel. I mean it, Diane. Do it right now." Ruth made a small, broken sound. Craig said Dennis's name once, sharply, but did not move from the doorway. The children had stopped. Everything in that room had stopped. And Diane looked at the floor her husband was pointing at, looked at Amber, who had gone perfectly still in that armchair with an expression caught somewhere between triumph and genuine alarm, and then looked back at Dennis Whitfield, the man she had handed 14 years of absolute, unconditional trust, and she saw him, with complete and final clarity, for exactly what he had always been. And she smiled, not warmly, not bitterly, simply with the recognition of someone who has waited a very long time for a specific moment to arrive and has just watched it walk through the door. She did not kneel. She reached into her bag and removed 2 sealed envelopes, each labeled in her clean, precise handwriting. She placed the first one on the coffee table in front of Ruth and said, "That one is for the family. It contains a summary of a private investigation completed 6 weeks ago. It documents Dennis's relationship with Amber in detail, dates, locations, photographs, and 2 receipts from this address, which tells me that Amber has been in this house, Ruth, on at least 2 occasions while I was driving 7 hours to Knoxville to sit with my dying father." The room did not breathe. Ruth's hand went to her mouth. Craig pushed off the door frame and took a single step into the room, then stopped as if he'd walked into glass. Dennis took a step toward Diane, and she turned to look at him with an expression so composed it stopped him as effectively as a wall. "Don't," she said. One word. He stopped. She placed the second envelope on the arm of the chair nearest him. "That one is from my attorney. It's the divorce filing, submitted to the Chatham County Court on Monday morning. Given the structure of my father's estate and the applicable provisions of Tennessee inheritance law, you have no claim to the inheritance. Barbara, my attorney, says the rest of the asset division is fairly straightforward and should move quickly." Dennis had gone the color of old paper. His mouth opened. "Your father's estate," he said, slowly, the way a man repeats something he cannot make add up. $41 million, Dennis, Diane said. "Howard spent 40 years building it, and the last 2 years of his life making absolutely certain you would never see a single penny of it. He knew, Dennis. He always knew. He just waited until it mattered." She picked up her bag. She looked at Ruth, who was crying now, quietly, into the dish towel she had been holding since Dennis walked through the door with Amber, and she said, gently, "I'm sorry, Ruth. I genuinely am. You were always kind to me, and you didn't deserve to be put in this position." She crossed that living room with the same straight-backed, unhurried walk that Howard Calloway had modeled for her in the hallways of the Knoxville house when she was a small girl. The walk of someone who knows the ground beneath them is solid because they built it themselves, one honest year at a time. She opened Ruth's front door and walked out into the cool Savannah evening, and she did not look back. Not once. There is a particular kind of freedom waiting on the other side of the worst thing someone could do to you, and it feels nothing like what you imagined during the long months of preparation. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like oxygen, like the first clean, full breath after a very long time underwater. Diane stood on that porch for just a moment, her father's gold necklace cool against her throat and the Savannah night air coming in off the river, and she closed her eyes and thought about Howard, about seeds, about patience, about all the ways a man can love his daughter without ever making a speech about it. Patricia was parked at the end of the block. She had driven down from Nashville specifically for this day, the only other person alive who had known the full plan, and when Diane got into the passenger seat, Patricia looked at her for a long moment and said, "How do you feel?" Diane considered the question honestly, the way she did everything, thoroughly and without performance. "I feel like my father would have found that acceptable," she said. Patricia laughed, that deep, rolling laugh, and pulled away from the curb into the Savannah night. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Dennis's attorney challenged several provisions and lost each one with a consistency that suggested Barbara had anticipated every argument before it was made, which she had, because Barbara was the kind of woman who prepared for the fight before the other side knew there was going to be one. Amber Cross disappeared from Dennis's public life shortly after the filing. Apparently, being the centerpiece of a family catastrophe has a way of accelerating clarity. Dennis lost the shared equity in the house, access to the joint savings, and found himself, for the first time in his adult life, without the quiet, competent woman who had been bearing the full weight of his household while he spent himself somewhere cheaper. Diane did not stay in Savannah. She went back to Knoxville, to Howard's house, to the rooms that smelled like cedar and old books and the particular silence of a life built with integrity. She sat at the kitchen table where she had learned to read balance sheets as a little girl and spent several weeks doing nothing more complicated than breathing in a place where she had first been loved correctly. She had the house renovated slowly, room by room, the way you restore something genuinely valuable, not rushing to cover what it was, but carefully, with full respect for its bones. She established a foundation in Howard's name, focused on business education and financial literacy for young women in rural Tennessee. She hired people she trusted, built deliberately, took her time the way Howard had always taken his time with anything worth doing. She did not date. She did not perform her recovery for anyone's approval. She simply worked and thought and began to understand that revenge, when it is done correctly, does not announce itself. It doesn't roar. It looks like a woman sitting at her father's kitchen table with $41 million and the complete, unhurried rest of her life stretched out in front of her like good, open road. The last word anyone close to Diane received from Dennis Whitfield came through a mutual acquaintance who ran into her at a conference in Nashville about a year after the divorce was final. He had relayed, with visible discomfort, that Dennis had been heard saying, these were apparently his exact words, "I never really knew who she was." Diane had listened, nodded once, and said, very quietly, he knew. He just never believed it would matter. Then she went back to her conversation. That is how the story of Diane Calloway ends. Not with spectacle, not with shouting, not with a single moment of weakness in front of the man who pointed at a floor and expected her to kneel. It ends with a woman sitting in her father's restored kitchen in Knoxville, Tennessee, watching the light change on the mountains through the window, knowing that every hard thing she ever endured was ground Howard had already prepared, and that the seeds he planted, in her, for her, because of her, had produced exactly what he always believed they would. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, do this one thing right now. Share this video with every person you know who has ever been made to feel smaller than they are. Drop a comment below with the single word Howard, so I know you stayed until the very end and understood what this story was truly about. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Leave a like if this stayed with you. And tell me in the comments who you were rooting for from the very first word. Because I will be here, and I will read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.